David. It's great to have you. I like to start with the main change we have decided internally and inside Callias Foundation. The new mission statement of the Circuit Symphony Orchestra and Callias Foundation is following. Follow us on our mission to inspire responsible listeners. So if we have the vision of the Silk Road Cultural Belt, the Conference of the Birds, as a new and different narrative for Europe, now the mission to inspire responsible listeners, based on also on the idea, partly based on the idea of the program of the BMW Foundation of the responsible leaders, responsible leadership. So from our side, and it's as a musical and artistic motive, we want to foster and mobilize the potential in different audiences, in our audience, to take responsibility for the role of being a listener. And what would be very interesting to know from you, I mean, you have traveled a lot along the Silk Road, lived along the Silk Road, and usually you are in the role of asking questions. And I mean, you are a great listener from how I remember you and from how I know you. So how would you describe this role of inspiring, or this mission of inspiring responsible listeners? What does that mean to you?
Oh, okay. So you're basically asking what this what image or what associations this brings to mind for me, regardless of what you guys are thinking about. But when I hear that, yeah, the first question I have, obviously, is, yeah, what is a responsible listener? What does that mean? And you guys may have a completely different idea about this, but I mean, the thing that for me is listening is truly very difficult. It's something that most people really don't fulfill or don't achieve fully. When you listen, you one of the things you need to do when you listen, let's talk about my work a little bit. The temptation that people have, and journalists have a lot of times when they're doing an interview, is to interject, is to jump in. And it's a person's telling you something, and this is sort of human nature. Because a conversation is sort of a social interaction, and so the person who's on the listening side very often wants to show support, or to encourage. A lot of times he or she will jump in with his or her own opinion, and it's really frustrating. The times that I notice this is when I'm doing an interview with another journalist, and often the other journalist will jump in, and will say whatever is on his mind or on her mind. And it's, by the way, I could choose one pronoun or the other, but I find this is pretty common across the genders. It's human nature. And one of the other things to do, obviously, is to jump in and to argue, to counter, to provide a counterpoint. All of these things, in my opinion, show that the person really isn't listening. especially with a counter argument. Because if you're coming up with a counter argument, means that, let's say it's you're talking, and instead of me really trying to hear you and hear what you're trying to say, is your mind is thinking of what the, of how, of how I disagree with you, how I, how this is wrong. And if you're thinking these things, then you're not really listening to the person. You're thinking, obviously, right? You're thinking about how you're right and how I'm right and you're wrong. And sorry, I'm mixing up my pronouns here. But if you interject, you're thinking about how you're right and the other person is wrong. And the thing about doing an interview is first of all, you really have to turn that off. You really have to listen closely to what the person is saying, even if you think this person is a horrible person, even if you're interviewing somebody who, is you consider to be morally or politically or whatever wrong. Because if you're interviewing them, the point is to hear their point of view, to understand their point of view, so that you can, if you're a journalist, write it down accurately. And so it's not easy. And in everyday conversations, I would say it's even more like that, and not just in journalistic conversations. Everyday conversations, sure, a conversation is an exchange of information, but for most part, as I'm convinced, it's 51% or 60% a social interaction. It's a way of establishing connections, to show that person that you're on his side or on her side, to connect with them emotionally, to support them emotionally, to establish a bond of some sort. Or on the other hand, to if you disagree with that person, to establish yourself. But it's not an exchange. I think, you support Trump, you're wrong in this, and this, and this. Well, it's not even an argument. It's just sort of this person gives his or her position, that person gives his or her position, and then, what's the point? So, as I say, it's very difficult. And you're doing a very good job, by the way. You're listening to me. You're not interrupting. You seem to be trying to get what I'm saying. And this is something that a lot of people just don't do. And especially if you have if it's a lively conversation, you both will jump in and and that's good. I mean, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Because obviously this is something that we as humans need. And as I say, conversation is a social interaction, and we are social animals, and we need that support, and we need those bonds, and we need all that other stuff. But if you're going to talk about listening, it's a completely different thing, and it's a bit frustrating, because to be a good listener, really a good listener, you really have to turn off all of these human instincts, all these things that we naturally do. And so there you have it's a bit of a dilemma. But one of the things that you, as a journalist, I find, and I mean, I didn't come up with this myself. There, I can't remember his name, the documentary filmmaker, the guy who did The Thin Red Line and Thin Blue Line. It'll come to me in a second. Morris. Whoever listens to this or will watch this will probably jump in immediately. He is a documentary filmmaker, and basically his method is to turn on the camera and just let people talk.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he's and his method is so simple, and obviously he spends, he gets hours and hours and hours of footage that he doesn't use. But it's a form of, I guess you could say, almost therapy for the person that is that's being interviewed. He doesn't talk, and these people are they fear the silence. They fear the fact that they're just sitting in front of a camera, and they naturally fill it in. And the most famous example of this was his first documentary, which he just let people talk, and it was about a murder case that there was controversy over whether the man who was jailed and I think put on death row, to be executed, whether he was really guilty. And this documentary filmmaker just let people talk. And ultimately, it emerged from all of these interviews, because these people couldn't shut up, quite literally. I mean, they really couldn't shut up, that he had been falsely accused. That he not falsely accused, that he had been falsely convicted. And a bunch of people in their interviews described how this happened. Although the first time around, they were part of the process that got him convicted. And afterwards, they accused this documentary filmmaker of tricking them into doing this, and he's by leading questions and things like that. And he said, "Of course, that's BS. What leading questions? I just turned on the camera. You can watch." This is a very roundabout way of saying that you need, in order to listen, you just got to let people talk, and you have to listen. That's the first thing. But it is extremely difficult to do. Extremely difficult. And so, as a responsible listener, getting back to the original question, that I would say that's that's not the only thing to do to be responsible. I think there are other things you can do, but it's the first thing you need to do. And without that, nothing is possible. Right?
Interesting. And do I understand you right that for you, being like responsibility, or to respond responsibly or responsible to, in a discussion, in a conversation, if there is an argument, if there are different point of views, do I understand you right that it's like one of the main parts is to really take out for a moment, all the personal, even natural social behaviors, like what interaction which comes up, where you want to interfere or interact, instead of just really to take responsibility for the role itself, that at this moment I'm listening. I understand you right?
Yeah,
as a role or as a position.
I don't know if it's necessarily as a role. I mean, it's these are different. These are different types of actions. I mean, it's not a role. You're not playing something. But in general, what you're saying is right. I mean, and I'd like to emphasize, the conversations perform any number of functions. So I'm not saying that it's bad that people interject. I'm not saying it's bad that they argue. I'm not saying it's bad that they get angry. Everything has a time and a place. But if we're talking about listening, and if we're talking about really getting information, whether that is musical information or factual information, you need to turn off these sort of human impulses, and it can work. I mean, I think the problem is that this is very topical right now for everybody. We live in a very polarized time today. The 6th of November, there are the midterm elections in the United States, and at times it seems that Americans aren't really doing much else than just screaming at each other. And even the conversations, and we're always talking about how we need to reach out and we need to try to understand the other side. But let's face it, when I've tried to have conversations with people who are on the other side of the political, aisle spectrum, it doesn't work out very well. It takes a lot of effort. And the problem is that you're not going to do any convincing, at least not in the beginning. The best that you can do is to understand the arguments of the person, even if you think that they're illogical, even if you think they're irrational, right? And based in just, based on BS concepts and basis. It's based on basis. But anyway, even if you think that, there is still a thought process going on. And I mean, this goes for people on the left and the right, people who vote, whatever. And it's difficult. It's very difficult, especially if you're dealing with somebody, if you feel that, is evil. If you are a dead set AfD, opponent. But in order to, the reason why I'm saying this is, in order to defeat the AfD, you have to understand it. You have to understand exactly what they're coming from, and also the stuff that's not said. If you ask somebody from, the far right in the United States, why do you believe this? They'll give you a lot of, sorry to use this word again, bullshit answers, stuff that they've convinced themselves to be true, right? But actually may not be the real reason why they have these, these convictions. But you're never going to find out, you're never going to get to the bottom unless you ask them. Unless you really ask them, and then you can start building on that. You can start, and you can hear the patterns, and you can hear, if you do it a lot. But as I say, it's hard. I mean, talking to 10 or 20 Trump supporters after a while, I'm sorry, I mean, I'm speaking as an American, can be extremely frustrating, because and quite honestly, I don't always have the patience for it. But when I do have the patience for it, I'm glad. I'm glad that I'm able to listen. So it's getting back to your original question. You say you have to turn yourself up. Yes, I'm not saying that you shouldn't engage in other conversations, everyday conversations, the way that I just, this interaction, the arguing, the supporting, all of the stuff that we do, laughter and crying and anger. These are all social. They're primarily there to create social bonds, I'm convinced. And despite the feeling that that this comes from somewhere deep inside of you, but I think there is an internal part of it, but it's to a large degree external. But in order to listen, if we're talking about listening, then you have to turn these things off. And if you turn these things off, you also have to turn off, to a certain degree, judgment, and that's really, really hard. But I believe that if you're capable of doing that every now and then, you will be rewarded.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, I find very, very interesting to see that there is one part of what you are explaining or describing is your role of being, your active role, being in a conversation with, for example, with a very, very extreme and foreign to your own convictions position, like, for example, a different political idea. And at the same time, you are listening, like it's like this fluidum where you are sending a message, and you are trusting, and you are convinced that there is a reason why this could be and maybe should be inspiring even for the other side. And then you are realizing that there is sometimes just a very, even maybe fanatical or a position or a prejudgment, so that the conversation becomes really very difficult. What we observe, I mean, from a position as an orchestra, like if we take the Sacred Symphony Orchestra the idea of the Silk Cultural Belt as an example how this gap in these different positions, or in the gap in perception even. I mean, in the ability to allow that it might be that there might be just to allow the thought that the idea of the so-called Silk Road, which we all immediately use with associations, might be completely different, and that there is just an orchestra, there is a group of musicians who want to show exactly this relationship and work on this relationship, that there are narratives, that there are like very, very deep convictions about an idea like the European flag, or basic human qualities like expressed in the Conference of the Birds from Farid Udinatar, or from or at the Silk Road Cultural Belt. So from your experience, what means, how would you describe the role of inspiring? I mean, if you're an active, also in your work, I mean, you are very, very, really very, I remember you, I mean, you have the great ability to ask in a way, and to also to listen in a way that it inspires to trust, for example. It inspires.
Thank you. I hope that's true.
No, I mean, it's there's always two sides. And I mean, there is, especially in these countries along the Silk Road, where it's sometimes very difficult to really inspire trust, or to inspire or to find a way that the other side is an audience, for example, or an orchestra, like if you remember in Almaty, that they freely and by their own will take responsibility for their role in a certain situation, to listen. And what helped you? I mean, how do you see this idea of inspiring, and the responsibility we have? I mean, if we are asking a question, for example, an orchestra asking a question to an audience.
I don't know. I mean, it's not much. I don't know what inspire. It's a difficult word. I don't know. I mean, what do you mean exactly? You mean inspire them to be responsible, inspire them to listen responsibly, right? That's what you're saying, right? That you, how do you do that? I don't know. Let me just say a couple of things that popped into my mind while I was listening to you, because actually your conversation started out in one place and ended up in another place. And so I was thinking of my answers. Unfortunately, I was listening and also thinking as you were speaking. I'd say first and foremost, the people respond to and what makes people feel comfortable, but also I think produces the most positive response, is treating them with respect. And okay, we're dealing with some very general phrases. What do I mean by that? Well, the problem is, if you unfortunately, we very often come into our conversations having already decided whether or not the person we're speaking to is, or we come into a conversation having already determined what level of respect the person we're speaking to. Our conversation with a waiter is completely different with a conversation with a friend. And this has to do with status, another of my favorite subjects. I'm convinced that we human beings are primates, and we are constantly judging and are status conscious. At the same time, so we are projecting our own concepts of status onto the other person. And at the same time, the other person is reacting, because what every person wants is what we very generally refer to as dignity, but basically is status. We want recognition of our level in society, because this is one of the few ways it may be the only way, but one of the very few ways we have of determining our own worth. And this also works with groups. That's not to say that we are disrespectful of everybody. We very often are, but there is sort of a level that you give people. Now, in coming into an interview, I don't think I was aware of this in Almaty, because I've only started thinking about this recently. But maybe I was on my way. If you're right, you mean is you have to enter every interaction if you want to inspire the person, if you want to make him or her feel comfortable, by indicating that you respect their level, you respect their dignity, you respect them, you think of them as a worthy and intelligent individual. And again, this is difficult. We don't really notice this. I mean, we're okay, fine. You and I are having this conversation. We're old acquaintances. I think highly of your work. You apparently think highly of mine. So the interaction of reflecting the respect that we have for each other, and also the acknowledgement of each other's dignity is easy. This is an easy conversation. It's another thing when you come to a person with another culture. You come with any number of assumptions, and a lot of the assumptions are based on real facts. I mean, if you come into a culture like Kazakhstan, which quite honestly I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that goes on there, societally as well. When I lived there, I mean, I like Kazakhstan, obviously, but I have to admit, I have a bit of a different outlook. But you still have to enter these conversations respecting the other person, and this is what's really difficult. This is what inspires the other person to accept you, and to open up, perhaps. And again, as I say, it's not easy. This is what I would say.
And what is exactly the challenge in your experience? Like, why is it so difficult? I mean, is it again that we have prejudgments when it comes, as you just said, if I understood right, from certain ideas of status, and that implies a certain set of self-value, like that which we cannot so flexibly all the time change.
Yeah, exactly, Moritz. I would say, but I mean, it's difficult. Look, we human beings we're constantly telling ourselves stories. At the moment, you and I are telling ourselves a story about how this conversation is going. We need this as a human being. We need what we describe as narratives. Is just a way of organizing information, where you can have a graph, or you can have a graph or a pie chart, and this is the way you can organize information. And a narrative is another way of organizing information. And this is the basic way that human beings organize information. We don't go around in our heads with lots of pie graphs. You know what I mean? We don't go around with a lot of bar graphs. What we do have is a lot of stories. And this counts for everybody. And the thing is, what I was going to say in the beginning, when you first started to ask this question, is what I'm also not saying is that all truths are equal, and that there's a moral relativism. All right. One of the problems I find that that a project like this and other projects like this would have is to say, well, everybody thinks their own thing, so it doesn't. All we have to do is reach out to the other person and try to understand him or try to understand her, and we'll all be okay. I am actually not a multiculturalist, although I believe in, as I say, respecting cultures, and I believe in listening to them. I nevertheless believe that Western culture is better. Now, that raises, I'm sure that if anybody hears that, they will be absolutely angry with me. But what am I supposed to say? I was born in the West. I was raised in the West. I am a product of this culture. Now, what I'm not saying, what I also recognize is that most people don't agree with me, which makes sense. They were born in other cultures. So what do we have? We have a conversation when you think one thing and I think another, or we have an argument. But an argument is not a bad thing. What I'm trying to do is convince you. I'm trying to convince you that that what I believe is correct. That's basically that's 99% of the interactions that you have every day, right?
Yeah, what I see as a great opportunity is to focus on three basic aspects. First, in this context, first, to take as an example the European flag just as an idea, as a symbol, connecting the universe and Earth, or planet Earth. Just this idea of the sky or the ocean or the blue, and then these 12 stars.
Right.
I mean, it's a very abstract idea, but also very clear, very, very direct, very practical. But still, this idea was written or was signed by a man who worked at the post office. So it was not a very philosophical discussion around this idea. And still, there is not, as we observe and as I observe, there is not a common narrative behind this idea. So we just said the Sacred Cultural Belt and the Conference of the Birds, for us, is a new and different narrative, or an idea, or an alternative narrative for this picture, or this idea, or this symbol of this flag. But now we have the challenge that, as you said, for example, we have this in Europe and all over this discussion: what's better, and what is superior, or what is leading? Who is leading? Who is listening? Like all these kind of questions, and that's very, very hard. I see, as you said. I mean. And I believe because of this, there are many reasons, but one reason is that we don't allow, or still only very few people allow to associate the European flag, for example, or the idea of Europe with another idea like the Silk Road. So
that's interesting. All right. So you said there are three. So there are three.
Yeah, it's like we have a vision, the Sacred Cultural Belt, as a new and different narrative for Europe. Europe not as a political system. Europe not even as a geographical space, but Europe as an idea of basic human qualities. Like, first. Second, we have a mission to inspire responsible listeners on a basic human level, being part of an audience, being part of a journey, being part of a process of learning from each other. We have a role. We are musicians. We have a role as an orchestra, and we want to support listeners in their goals, in their interests, in their activities, to develop themselves. So for example, to translate basic human conditions, qualities, narratives, as